and it's a huge week for Brazil as they're setting up for a presidential election where we're going to see Lula come up against Bolsonaro, an election that was denied by a corrupt system that had American involvement in the political persecution and illegal imprisonment of Lula da Silva in the last presidential election. And we wanted to cover it a little bit. We're going to definitely dedicate next week's episode to breaking down whatever happens. Polls have been looking really good for Lula. The question really is going to be whether or not he's going to be able to win an outright first round victory. But again, these things can be wrong. So we'll be doing more on this, but we want to give everyone a little preview, set the stage a little bit, get people a little excited, and remember just how stark of a contrast these world visions are between Lula and Bolsonaro. Because really, you put up a nasty Republican candidate or even a Trump over a Biden, right? There's a difference between them. I'm not saying there's not, but this is an election where it's clear as damn day. The vision for society, the vision for the world between these two folks. Remember, Lula, former president of Brazil, but many people forget that he was the former president of the Steelworkers Union, who was imprisoned by the military dictatorship. Lula lost a finger, one of his fingers, when he was working at 19 at an auto plant, right? He's running again for president against Bolsonaro, the clown fascist, little fancy boy, who has been an active and impassioned supporter of the military dictatorship, both when it was in power, right? He was a very passionate defender of it, and in some ways too passionate because it got him into a bit of trouble when he was in the military, who under his presidency, a presidency that was effectively stolen because of the actions of the justice system in Brazil, which erroneously put Lula in prison, has literally been burning the country down. Not metaphorically, literally been burning the country down. And I think it's important to remember, we're going to talk a bit about the policy difference, about the moral difference between these people. But I do think narratively, too, it's worth remembering. Lula is somebody who comes up from the working class, fights in the union movement at a time when it was extremely difficult to do so, right? Not as hard as, in any situation to fight for workers' rights. It's hard in a country like the United States to do that today. It's hard like in the United States to do that in the early 20th century. But Lula was doing that when there was a military dictatorship, when your rights were not guaranteed, right? When it was really like the law of the strong over the weak, that was the rule of the society. And Lula said, I'm going to stand up with my fellow working people to fight against the system. While that was going on, Bolsonaro was a very impassioned supporter of it. And you can see that in their politics today. When Bolsonaro, this has happened a couple of years ago, but just to give people like a sense of it, because I think, there's so many outrageous stories about Bolsonaro, you forget about a lot of them. When Bolsonaro was speaking about child labor, which is a real problem in Brazil, which has been made much, much worse by the poverty that Bolsonaro has created in the country. You know what Bolsonaro said about child labor, Matt? I bet you can actually guess. He said, when he was a boy, he helped out on his father's farm. And, quote, it didn't do him any harm, excuse me. Right? I mean, like that's the care that Bolsonaro gives to children who are forced into real labor, right? Not just like doing some chores once in a while, real labor because of the poverty created by him and his friends.
Are we sure Bolsonaro didn't get kicked in the head by a mule?
I wouldn't be surprised. And look, this weekend, Brazilians get to vote between these two men who have extremely and distinctly different visions for the future of Brazil. Here, just to set this up, is Lula talking a little while ago. I borrowed this from Brian Meir about workers' rights in Brazil. And this is in Portuguese, so I'm sorry, folks who are listening to the podcast version. You're going to have to find it. It's worth finding, though.
Porque é engraçado esse mundo. Veja, eu sou teu empregado. Eu peço aumento para você. Você me nega aumento. Não acontece nada com você. Aí eu tenho para vender minha mão de obra. Eu faço uma greve, a polícia vem para cima de mim. Por que a polícia não foi para cima de você que negou? Por que só vem para cima de mim? Ora, você vendo o teu emprego e eu vendo a minha força de trabalho.
I mean, hell yeah. Like right there, like very clearly showing that even in what most people I think would consider to be an acceptable justice system, Lula is making the point that these systems are set up to attack the poor and protect the power of the rich. And what's Bolsonaro been up to? This. fucking around with some of the nastiest, most right-wing, hate-filled people in the world. Tucker Carlson has taken an extreme liking to Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro's taken an extreme liking to Carlson and the whole Trump movement as well, right? It's not even a one-off. Bolsonaro has surrounded himself with right-wingers in the military in Brazil and also globally. And when when you read Washington Post, when you read kind of mainstream news on this story, I don't think this is an inaccurate picture. But one of the points that is often being made is that this is really a question, an election about democracy and kind of pushing back on Bolsonaro. And I think that's a completely valid point to make. But I think that also sort of peppers over the very stark reality of what working people in Brazil have been suffering over the past few years. But the democracy question is no small bit. For people who watch the show, this already. Bolsonaro has basically threatened to not respect the results of the election. And from the get-go, has surrounded himself with the military, which is a big faux pas in Brazil because, as I was noting earlier, this is a country that in living memory was under military dictatorship. So there had always sort of been an unofficial bar on surrounding yourself with military appointees into your government. Bolsonaro broke that almost immediately. And here's Brian Muir reporting on Bolsonaro and some of the fears about the democratic threat that Bolsonaro makes.
Far-right President Jair Bolsonaro and military generals serving in his cabinet have been threatening to disrespect the election results if former President Lula, who is leading in all of the polls, wins the elections. This has led many observers to believe that the military may support an auto coup this October.
The big problem of the backwards bourgeois leading Brazil is that Lula did what they were never able to do for the nation and the people. So today they are afraid of us coming back because the population will certainly remember this, and it will be very hard for them to take back power in the future.
President Bolsonaro and his defense minister have made a series of baseless claims that the electronic voting system, which has never been hacked in the 30 years since it was implemented, is susceptible to fraud. They've created a new department in the army called the Cybernetic Crime Division and are pressuring the Electoral Court to allow it to audit the elections.
How can the leaders of the Brazilian military meddle in the elections? This isn't their role. Elections belong to the people, and the people are showing that they prefer to rebuild Brazil with Lula.
A recent internal study commissioned by the defense minister that was leaked to the press shows that both the Air Force and Navy Command would be willing to support an auto coup in October, but the leadership of most state military police forces and the Army, which is twice as large as the Air Force and Navy combined, are opposed to any rupture with democracy.
Today the conditions needed for a coup aren't in place. Even though they want to do it, when they complain about the electronic voting system, they're trying to set a mood for a coup. But the Brazilian people and the national and international political context will not yet allow this kind of adventure.
With Brazil's presidential elections less than 20 days away, the population nervously awaits their results. Brian Muir, Telesur, Recife.
And again, I think that people should take these threats extremely seriously, because Bolsonaro has been setting this up. And why is he doing that? It's because it is very clear that he does not have popular support to win this presidential election, right? He's going to get some votes, don't get me wrong. But it's very clear that he has lost whatever he had when he was able to win his first election. And what he had then, by the way, was a judicial process that pulled Lula out of the race on erroneous charges that the United Nations, right? Which is not like I know sometimes people on the left have like a little bit of a halo about that organization. It's not an organization that typically steps in moments like this, has said that process of taking away, of imprisoning Lula, the investigation against him and the trial against him violated his basic human rights. The United Nations has shown this. And the fact that it was thrown out because it was so erroneous, so nonsensical, the charges against him, was what was allowed Bolsonaro to come into power in the first place. And Bolsonaro, who ran on an anti-corruption, clean up the government campaign, has been running one of the most corrupt, open piggy bank kind of government since he's come into power in Brazil. And I'll remind folks that the advantage that we have here is that what Bolsonaro is doing is so nonsensical that what he's pushing right now is so untethered from reality that it's very important that people be paying attention to this election, because people don't like to do coups underneath a fine light. They like to do them when they're obscured, when they're hidden from people. And it's very important that we continue to highlight this as we go into this election, because it's very clear which way the vote should be going. And Bolsonaro is trying to set himself up to try to deny these so that he can continue to pillage Brazil.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the concerning thing is, you know, you hear the analysis that I think seems fair, and the same one I did about Trump, which is that the individual politician Bolsonaro, or in our case Trump, definitely wants a coup. They would definitely love, you know, authorities to step in and deliver the office for them. Those authorities' willingness to do so is another question, but that can also change. And, you know, I mean, anybody that's our age knows that the Supreme Court decided the 2000 election, not the American people. And this is just how parties, like, this is not foreign to these parties in power.
Now, it's been very good too that I think, in no small part, by the way, because Michael Brooks has made Brazil such a big issue on the left, that there has been a lot of outspoken warnings from people on the left in power about potential election, denial from Bolsonaro. Bernie Sanders has been pushing the United States government to take a position that they will not accept a military coup in Brazil. And it's been very notable, not that irony gets us too far with the Republican Party, that all these boys like Marco Rubio, little Marco, who were so worried about election integrity, and all these other countries were so involved. The United States needs to play a big role in it when it comes to toppling another democratically elected leader, Evo Morales in Bolivia, now say it's not America's place to get involved in these kind of things, right? Again, hypocrisy only gets you so far with these people, but it's very good that Bernie Sanders right now is sitting in the United States Congress and saying these kind of things, because it shows that there is a light on this country, that when Bolsonaro does try to play, because he's going to try to do something, the question is going to be, does he have the ability to follow through on it? And that's going to come down to a couple things: popular movements, social movements, and whether or not the military and rich people in that country think that Bolsonaro is a viable tool for them to use to maintain their power. But going back to the kind of popular coverage on this, right? So when you read, again, like big time international or national news in the United States, it's democracy, return to normalcy, and another thing, the Amazon. And I just want to say this up top, because the Brazil elections right now have absolutely important implications for the survival of the Amazon. But I think it's really important that we talk about this in the right way, because it's very important to defend the Amazon. But you can't do that in a way that like flattens the Brazilian people and the indigenous people to a secondary position, wherein like their worth is only to be the stewards of the land. They deserve the same rights to a better and more prosperous life as anyone else. And that is a possibility with a conscious program of pro-worker, pro-people, pro-environmental policy that has been outlined by Lula da Silva. I guess I just have to say it, because I hear people talk about the Amazon who I've never heard express any concern for the people in Brazil. And I think that just kind of really reeks of a nasty kind of imperialism to me.
Yeah, and it sets you up for an attack from the right, saying like you don't care about that, you just care about your green priorities,
which is what Bolsonaro argues too.
Right, and to add to that, there's this from this Guardian article: Amazon deforestation reduced 80% between 2004 and 2012 under the Workers' Party administration of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. Bolsonaro has steadily dismantled or discredited the mechanisms that achieved that satellite monitoring personnel on the ground and legislation to punish offenders. So, like, yeah, it is doable, and it's actually been done.
Yeah. No, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, we've seen that from the policies that Lula has been outlining in coordination with a lot of movements and people who are very much affected by it. This is a report here on the indigenous movements in Brazil that I think really highlights, again, the stark difference. Actually, before we get there, and point out Lula's positive vision, let's just remind people about what the situation is in the Amazon if you're not familiar. The National Space Research Agency has found 31,000 fires in the Amazon just in this past month, right? Making it one of the worst months in Brazilian history. And a hell of a lot has to do with the policy of Brazil. Most importantly, Bolsonaro's very clear flaunting of the law and the legal system in that country. And as he's been going out publicly and saying things along the lines of, go take whatever land you want, burn down whatever you want, log whatever you want, cut down whatever you want. And we're not going to touch you. Right. So it's not even, while he has pulled back a lot of environmental regulations, it's also gotten way worse because basically whichever ones are still in the books, Bolsonaro's just saying, ignore them, do whatever you want. And I mean, can you imagine the kind of crisis and chaos situation that creates in a country like Brazil, which much like the United States, has a history of a certain class of people, a certain race of people, basically saying, we're going to do whatever we want. To hell with the people who live in and need this land. It's a good reminder of whatever happened to the law and order Jair, right? Yeah. But here's a report on the indigenous movements in Brazil and how they're sort of aligning with Lula.
But lately, Brazil's 1 million indigenous people have been making their voices heard in the centers of political power.
We had to unite indigenous people from all over the country and make strategic alliances in Brazil and abroad to fight our common enemy, President Jair Bolsonaro. His government has been pushing for legislation opening our lands to commercial mining and farming and turning a blind eye to the destruction of the Amazon.
The goal is to fight back by electing their own lawmakers, and they have significant support. An organization called the Articulation of Brazil's Indigenous People is backing 30 candidates, like Sônia Guajajara, recently described by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world.
We have never suffered so much violence in indigenous territories like now, with attacks and assassinations.
The independently run Indigenous Missionary Council registered 305 cases of attacks in 226 indigenous territories in 2021. That's 3 times more than in 2018. Earlier this year, indigenous expert Bruno Pereira and British journalist Dom Phillips were shot dead by a local fisherman in a remote area of the Amazon. The killings attracted global attention. Pereira had been helping indigenous patrols investigate illegal fishing and poaching in the Javari Valley. The territory is home to the world's largest number of isolated tribes, and the invaders were allegedly working for drug cartels. World-renowned photographer Sebastião Salgado, like many others, points the finger at Bolsonaro.
I blame the government for the deaths of Bruno Pereira and Dom Phillips because the president left the Amazon unprotected, permitting criminal gangs to take over. Violence in the Amazon has increased tremendously.
Long before the presidential election campaign started, hundreds of indigenous tribes gathered in Brasilia to put their demands in writing. Sônia Guajajara presented the document to leftist candidate Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who's leading in the polls against current President Bolsonaro. He signed it and promised to create a ministry for the indigenous.
I mean, clear as day, as Bolsonaro is basically encouraging gangs of thugs to attack indigenous people and murder them. Lula is there signing pledges and listening to the demands and the concerns of people. I mean, again, I don't think that these two focuses that we've seen in mainstream media about these things are wrong and inaccurate. But I also just want to remind people of the stakes and also who's very clearly, particularly when it comes to environmental policy and indigenous rights, is sitting there and listening, and who's actually aggravating a horrific war against people. And remember, there's history here. I mean, when it comes back to election integrity, remember, this is a country. People forget this because obviously Bolsonaro coming to power was such a pivotal moment. But don't forget that before Bolsonaro comes into power, you had Dilma Rousseff, who was elected leader of the country, get taken down too with another kind of erroneous attacks against her, nonsensical legal charges against her that basically forced her to be impeached. And then Michel Temer comes in and continues austerity, waging war on the Amazon, and Bolsonaro inherits that, right? So if you have to think about it, if you're a Brazilian person, this has been a long time since you have actually had a real presidential election that hasn't been sort of mired in this kind of nonsensical stuff, right? And is a real opportunity after years and years and years of backtracking on the successful policies of the PT to right that ship. Lastly, I wanted to go back to hunger, because that is the thing about Lula that I think is incredibly important. People might not be familiar, but Lula made dealing with hunger in Brazil one of his major planks of his government. And he was extremely effective, created food programs for the poor and social programs for the poor that literally you can measure their success in the heights of generation of children. Right. I want to say that again. I mean, we're talking so nuts and bolts stuff that you can actually see it in people, the benefit of a Lula government versus these kind of right-wing authoritarian systems. And what's so horrific about what Bolsonaro's government has meant for people is that not only is he waging war on working people, not only is he waging war on the Amazon, he's actually brought back successfully hunger on a large scale to Brazil. Right now, there are 33 million people in Brazil who are living in hunger. I mean, that is astronomical. When you think about not just when you measure hunger too, like we're talking about people who are in like extreme hunger, who like do not basically have enough calories to survive. More than half the country under Bolsonaro's government now is under food insecurity, which means that it is not a sure thing at the end of the day or at the end of the week that you're going to have enough food to get by. And remember that not only is this something that's preventable, it is something that had been, dealt with in the past quite successfully by Lula and the PT government. I want to put up one last report on this because I think it's really important to highlight that these are the stakes here. There is the dream of a stronger working class in Brazil. There is a dream of a more prosperous future. But there is also the very, very clear need to undo the damage that Bolsonaro has done in this country and to return dignity for everyday people in Brazil. And it's horrific to think that hunger has come back in such extremes under Bolsonaro after Lula had been so successful at dealing with it in the past.
State and federal aid is irregular and insufficient. 15 years ago, Brazil had eradicated extreme poverty. But 6 years ago, the situation began reverting, and now Brazil is back on the hunger map. According to Brazil's Institute on Food Security, today more than 33 million Brazilians are going hungry, and nowhere more so than here in the state of Alagoas. In the absence of effective policies to combat poverty and unemployment, malnutrition and hunger has more than doubled, and that is having a devastating impact on the development of children like these. Academics point out that the last two governments began reducing or eliminating social programs long before the pandemic.
The existence of hunger is a political decision. Hunger is caused by the decision not to implement public policies that could fight it. There's been a political decision to prioritize other things.
I mean, clear as day. You've seen what has happened over the last two governments when it comes to these things. The decision, I think, is very clear. I know I've been a little dour, but it's just so devastating, to see what can happen when you backslide into right-wing reaction in a country, to see things that were so successful be completely gutted. Now, let's get to the positives, right? It's looking really damn good for Lula. Not only is he polling well, the movements that are supporting him are very well organized. There have been massive shows of support for him all across the country. While there is the fear of this kind of right-wing military threat, it is not as if there is not a highly motivated and mobilized social movement politics in the country of Brazil right now. And that's exactly what you need in a moment like this when the results of an election could be attacked by somebody like Bolsonaro. We'll definitely be doing more next week as we get results. I'm hoping that we'll have one of our great Brazilian guests on. It might be a little tough just because it'll be so crazy their day after, but hopefully we'll be able to do something on that next week. And I also just want to add as like a little side note, we talked about with Brian Muir. one of the things that Bolsonaro sort of claimed in his victory, one of the things that people sort of attribute to his victory in the first round, in his first election, was his capturing of this growing evangelical movement in Brazil. And one thing that I think has been so encouraging has been the inroads with the evangelical community that Lula has made, particularly with women. So while it seems like Bolsonaro is still going to get a large amount of, these hyper Christian nationalist reactionaries, a lot of evangelical voters, people who go to evangelical churches in Brazil, have been pulled back or to the PT orbit. And I think Lula, doing what he does so well, has been really great at that, because he's offered a lot of fig leaves. You see him when he's on the campaign trail. He's oftentimes quoting the Bible, right? Speaking a language, that is mobilizing and motivating to people. In addition to all of his other kind of policies, I mean, Lula is probably one of the most gifted politicians of our era. I don't think you can really argue that. You can dislike him even. Like, I'm just saying, like, pure, like, analysis, game day analysis kind of thing. Lula is a very skilled politician, and it's very important and lucky that in this moment he's the person who's able to, be holding the flag, fighting for a better future for Brazilian people.
Yeah, I just want to comment on one thing before we play this clip of Michael Brooks talking to Lula. But that the point that she made, and it's good to see that point made on the news, that poverty and hunger, particularly, or both, are policy choices. Mm-hmm. And we saw that here with the Democrats passing a child tax credit that took a chunk and didn't solve it. It was too modest a program, but we could have severely, and it took a severe chunk out of child hunger and poverty. And then we decided, because of Joe Manchin, who we're going to be talking about with Darna, decided that no. And the one thing that I would just amend about what the sociologist said there about the choice is that it's not that they just happen to prioritize other things. There are people that run these governments that want poverty. They want poverty as a coercive, as a cudgel to control people. It's not, and so when you say it's just like, and I'm not blaming that person, I'm just saying, like, we have to think about this. It's not an accident. It's not just like, oh, it got lost in this big shuffle of papers. No, that want is valuable to the type of people that when Bolsonaro says, yeah, go cut down those forests. Those people, they like that hunger.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's very true. Well, I think to close, I don't know if you have this handy map.
So this is part two, at the end of part two, with the Lula interview, Michael Brooks and Brazil Wire. And this is Michael asks Lula about sort of like, on top of policy, what are the sort of spiritual things that, make you want to run again? And Lula goes back into this hunger point. And I'll just translate for folks here. Brazil has returned. I'll turn up a little bit. Brazil has returned to the hunger map. The number of people who have started sleeping on the street in this country. I didn't see children begging on the streets of Brazil anymore. Now children are back on the streets begging. Children are living under bridges in a rich country like Brazil. It doesn't make sense. Forbes published a list of the 20 richest men in Brazil. Sincerely speaking, people say I am a radical. I am not a radical. I am more human. I learned how to be more human in jail. I reflect more. I look over my 70 years of life and realize that I have to fight more. I have to argue more. I have to. You cannot accept the idea that Brazilian elites don't accept the economic growth of the poor. They don't accept that the poor can have the right to health care, education, water, school, everything that can feed them. They don't accept that the poor have these things. So I am not radical, Brian. I'm a lot more political. I have a lot more political consciousness. And for this reason, I want to fight a lot more. Oh, but Lula wants to come back. Lula got out of jail angry. Lula got out of jail. And now he wants to polarize. I really want to polarize. I want to make deep ideological debates. I want the people to know that there is no teaching anywhere that says a person has to go 3 days without food. There is no teaching that says a person should not wake up in the morning and not have a cup of milk or a piece of bread to give their child. In a rich country like this one, so this is why it looks like I am more angry. It looks like I am radical, but I am not. And we can...
Yeah. I mean, I think that puts it rather clearly. So we'll all be watching very closely. I'm very excited. I think we have a really good shot at being able to right a lot of these wrongs. And I've been very proud of the social movements in Brazil. Been very inspired by them, and certainly inspired by Lula's courageousness. So we'll be watching this. We'll be doing more on this next week. One last time. I know it's not the slogan anymore because he's free, but I did want to do one last Lula Livre, baby.
Lula Livre, yeah.
Let's see it happen. I mean, this could be a really momentous weekend for everybody. So we'll be watching very closely, everybody, and best of luck to everyone in Brazil.